The great hall of Thorngard did not smell of a wedding. It smelled of damp stone, centuries of spilled wine, and the suffocating, sickly sweet scent of pity. To Lenara Quillen, it smelled like her own execution. She stood at the foot of the iron dais, her head bowed so low that her chin grazed the itchy lace of her collar. The gown was magnificent, a heavy thing of silver silk and crushed velvet, embroidered with river pearls that felt like stones dragging her down into the cold floor. But it was a lie. The hem was an inch too long, pooling clumsily around her feet, and the bodice had been pinned aggressively tight to accommodate a frame far slighter than the woman for whom it was intended. Lenara was the omega who fit into the leftover spaces. The filler, the patch stitched hastily over a wound the kingdom refused to let heal. "Do you?" The high priest's voice rasped, echoing off the vaulted ceiling where banners of war hung limp in the stagnant air. "Lenara of House Quillen, accept the weight and the blood of the Moric line? Do you vow to serve, to bleed, and to bear, until the moon calls you home?" The vows were archaic, cruel. They were not promises of partnership. They were a contract of surrender. Lenara swallowed. Her throat felt lined with ash. She could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes boring into her back. She could hear the whispers, soft as rustling dry leaves but sharp as skinning knives. "She is so small, a poor substitute for the Lady Soraya. Look at her hands, they are trembling like a rabbit's. He won't keep her through the winter. Once the alliance is signed, she will be sent to the Silent Tower." "I do," Lenara whispered. The words were barely a breath, lost in the vast, shadowy space. "Louder," the priest commanded, his eyes flat and bored. "I do," she said again, forcing her voice to carry over the hum of the crowd. A ripple of unease went through the room. A weak queen for a warrior kingdom. A fragile, silent omega, for the Alpha King known across the continent as the Render. Lenara dared to lift her gaze, just a fraction, to look at the man standing before her. Alpha King Draven Moric was a mountain of a man, a figure carved from midnight and violence. He wore his ceremonial furs like armor, his broad shoulders tense, radiating a heat that Lenara could feel from 2 feet away. He did not smell like the floral oils the servants had doused the room in. He smelled of ozone, of a storm about to break, and deep beneath that, the copper tang of fresh blood. He had not looked at her once, not when the heavy oak doors groaned open, not when she walked the long, lonely aisle, not now, as they stood breath to breath at the altar. His gaze was fixed somewhere over her head, staring at the stained glass window depicting the first Wolf King tearing the throat out of a demon. His jaw was locked so tight a muscle feathered beneath the skin of his cheek. A scar, jagged and white, ran from his temple down. Into the high collar of his tunic, a souvenir from the war that had won him this throne. He looked like a man awaiting a sentencing, not a groom awaiting his bride. "And do you?" The priest turned to the king, his voice trembling slightly. "Draven, Alpha of Alphas, King of the High North, accept this wolf as your mate and queen?" The silence that followed was agonizing. 1 second stretched into an eternity, then 2, 3. The hall held its breath. Lenara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "He is going to refuse," she thought, a cold wave of nausea washing over her. "He is going to turn around and walk away, just like Soraya did to him." It was the scandal that had nearly broken the kingdom. The Alpha King had chosen Lady Soraya, a beta of immense beauty and political standing. He had courted her. He had offered the throne, and she had laughed, fled across the sea with a southern duke, and left Draven Moric standing alone with a kingdom that demanded a queen. Lenara was the correction, the daughter of a minor banner man, an omega with no prospects, no wolf song, and a reputation for obedience. She was safe. She was invisible. She was here because she had no choice. Finally, Draven spoke. "I accept." His voice was a low rumble, vibrating through the floorboards, deep enough to rattle Lenara's bones, but it was flat, dead. He sounded like a general ordering a flank maneuver in a losing battle. Then, by the laws of the old code, seal the union. This was the part Lenara feared most. Draven turned toward her. For the first time, his body angled in her direction, blocking out the torchlight. He was massive, blotting out the world. She waited for him to lift her chin, to look into her eyes, to give her some sign of humanity. He didn't. He stepped forward, invading her space with a sudden, predatory grace. His large hand came up, not to hold her, but to roughly sweep the heavy hair away from the curve of her neck. His fingers were, calloused from the sword hilt, burning hot against her cold skin. Lenara flinched. Draven paused. For a fraction of a second, his hand hovered there, his thumb brushing the pulse point that fluttered wildly in her throat. He inhaled sharply, a ragged intake of breath, as if he had caught a scent that confused him. His body went rigid, like a bowstring pulled to the breaking point. But the moment passed. He lowered his head. There was no tenderness. He didn't kiss the skin first to numb it. He simply sank his teeth into the junction of her shoulder and neck. Lenara gasped, a sharp cry tearing from her lips as his canines pierced the tender flesh. It wasn't the mating bite that could only happen when the heat took them, but the claim of the house. A ceremonial marking to show she was property of the crown. It burned. It stung. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring the sea of faces watching them. Draven pulled back almost immediately. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes dark, pupils blown wide, black swallowing the amber irises. He looked disturbed, like he had tasted something that frightened him. He turned his back on her before the blood had even begun to well. "It is done," he growled to the room, his voice rougher than before. "Feast. Drink. Leave us." He didn't offer her his arm. He didn't wait for her to gather her heavy skirts. He strode down the dais steps, the heavy velvet of his cloak billowing behind him like a storm cloud, leaving his new queen standing alone at the altar, with a trickle of blood staining the white lace of a dress that wasn't hers. The royal suite was a fortress within a fortress. The walls were rough-hewn granite, draped in tapestries depicting great winter hunts and dying stags. The fireplace was large enough to stand in, the flames licking high and casting long, dancing shadows that looked like claws raking across the floor. In the center stood the bed, a massive four-poster monstrosity carved from ironwood, hung with heavy furs. Lenara stood by the door, her hands clasped in front of her stomach to stop them from shaking. The heavy oak door had been shut and barred by the guards outside. They were alone. Draven had stripped off his ceremonial cloak and thrown it carelessly onto the floor. He stood by the balcony doors, staring out into the snowy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the iron-framed panes, but the tension inside the room felt far more dangerous. He had been pacing for 20 minutes, back and forth, like a caged tiger. Every few seconds, a low, vibrating sound emanated from his chest, a growl he seemed to be suppressing with great effort. His hands opened and closed at his sides, flexing as if he wanted to strangle something. Lenara hadn't moved. She was terrified that if she made a sound, his aggression would turn toward her. She was an Omega. Her instincts were screaming at her to bare her throat, to submit, to make herself small. But she was. Already so small, she felt like she was disappearing. "My lord?" she whispered eventually. The silence was becoming heavier than the air in a tomb. Draven stopped mid-stride. He didn't turn. His hands braced against the stone frame of the balcony arch, his knuckles white. "Don't," he rasped. His voice sounded wrecked, as if he had been screaming for hours. "Don't speak to me." Lenara flinched as if he had struck her. I only wish to know if you required— I require nothing from you." He cut her off, his voice dropping to a snarl that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Do you understand?" "Nothing." The cruelty of it took her breath away. She knew this was a political match. She knew he didn't love her, but she had expected civility. She had expected a partnership, however cold. She had not expected to be hated for simply existing. "I am your wife," she said, a sudden spark of dignity rising through her fear. It was a quiet defiance, but it was there. "I am your queen. You chose me." Draven laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound, devoid of humor. He turned then, finally looking at her. Lenara's breath hitched in her throat. His eyes were wild. The amber was gone, replaced by a glowing, incandescent gold that swirled with something akin to madness. His shirt was unbuttoned at the top, revealing the sheen of sweat on his chest. Despite the chill in the drafty room, he looked feverish. "I didn't choose you," he sneered, walking toward her. He moved with that terrifying, fluid speed of a predator closing in on a wounded fawn. "I chose a treaty. I chose a womb to produce an heir, so the council would stop braying at my door. Do not mistake a contract for desire, Lenara." He stopped 3 feet from her. The heat coming off him was suffocating. He smelled of pine and wood smoke, but also of something sharper distress. "You are here," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that scraped against her skin like sandpaper. "Because the one I wanted was not." The words landed like physical blows. Because the one I wanted was not. Lenara felt the tears welling, hot and humiliating, but she refused to let them fall. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron, focusing on the pain to ground herself. "I see," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the shattering of her heart. "Then I will not burden you with my presence." Draven stared at her, his chest heaving. He looked as if he wanted to say something else, his lips parting, his brow furrowed in a mixture of agony and rage. He took a step closer, his hand twitching as if to reach out, but then he violently recoiled, turning away and marching back to the window. "Go to sleep," he commanded, his back to her. "Or stare at the wall. It makes no difference to me. Just stay quiet. Stay away from me." Lenara watched him for a long moment. He was the king. He was the most powerful wolf in the north. And he was a man broken by a woman who wasn't here. She looked at the bed she was supposed to share with him. The furs looked like a trap. If she lay down there, she would just be waiting for him to decide to use her, waiting for him to see her as a vessel, a replacement, a warm body to help him forget Soraya. A cold clarity settled over her. She was an Omega. She had been raised to be soft, to be yielding, to endure, but she was also a Quillen. Her father might have been a minor lord, but he had taught her one thing before he died. Dignity is the only thing they cannot take from you unless you give it. She would not sleep in this bed. She would not let him wake up in the morning and look at her with that mix of resentment and disappointment. Quietly, moving with the silent tread that had allowed her to survive 22 years of being overlooked, Lenara walked to the small dressing room adjoining the suite. She didn't change into her nightgown. Instead, she stripped off the heavy, hateful dress. She left it in a pile on the floor, the pearls clicking against the stone. She found the sturdy traveling cloak she had arrived in a simple gray wool. She pulled it over her undershift. She found her boots, trading the satin slippers for leather. She packed nothing. She had brought nothing of value into this marriage, and she would take nothing out. She stepped back into the main room. Draven was still at the window, his forehead pressed against the cold glass. He seemed lost in a trance, his breathing ragged. He hadn't moved. Lenara looked at his broad back one last time. A pang of sorrow struck her, sorrow for him, for herself, for the waste of it all. "Goodbye, my king," she thought. "I hope you find her, because you will never find me again." She turned toward the heavy oak door. It would be difficult to get past the guards, but she knew the castle's servant passages better than anyone realized. She had spent the week before the wedding exploring them, hiding from the courtiers who mocked her. She could be gone before sunrise. She would go to the convent of the Silver Moon in the far west. They took in stray wolves. They wouldn't care that she was a runaway queen. She reached out, her fingers wrapped around the cold iron handle of the door. She pressed the latch down. Click. The sound was microscopic in the roaring silence of the room, but the reaction was instantaneous. A sound tore through the room, not a word, not a shout, but a roar, a primal, subterranean thunder that shook the dust from the tapestries and rattled the window panes. Before Lenara could push the door open, a force slammed into the wood above her head. Wham! The door shuddered in its frame, slammed shut by a hand that hit with the force of a falling tree. Lenara gasped, spinning around, her back pressed flat against the wood. Draven was there. He had moved across the room faster than thought, faster than a human eye could track. He loomed over her, caging her in with his body. His hands were planted on the door on either side of her head, trapping her. But it was his face that stopped her heart. The cold indifference was gone. The calculation was gone. His face was a mask of savage desperation. His lips were pulled back from his teeth, a low, continuous growl rumbling in his chest, vibrating through her own sternum. And his eyes. They weren't just gold anymore. They were burning. They were dilated so wide the black swallowed everything, fixed on her with a terrifying intensity. He wasn't looking past her. He wasn't thinking of Soraya. He was looking at her. He was breathing hard, gulping air as if he had been drowning and she was the surface. He leaned in, burying his face in the curve of her neck, right where he had bitten her hours ago. He inhaled, a desperate, shuddering sound, smelling the fear, the resolve, and the hidden scent of her that had been masked by the perfume. Where? His voice was a ruin, a grind of gravel and glass. Where do you think you are going? Lenara trembled, her knees turning, to water. The heat radiating from him was scorching. I am leaving. You said you required nothing. I said nothing, he roared, pulling back to look at her, his hands shaking against the wood. I didn't say leave. I didn't say you could leave. You don't want me, Lenara cried out, the fear giving way to a sudden burst of hysterical honesty. I am the second choice. I am the replacement. I am not Soraya. At the sound of that name, Draven flinched, his eyes squeezing shut for a second. But when they snapped open, the madness was worse. I don't care about Soraya, he snarled, the words tearing out of him as if they hurt physically. He leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, his weight pressing her into the door. The contact sent a shockwave of electricity through Lenara's body, so strong it made her toes curl. Then why? She whispered, tears finally spilling over. Why treat me like a ghost? Draven's hands curled into fists against the wood, splintering the grain. He looked at her as if he wanted to devour her and as if he was terrified of her, all at once. Because, he rasped, his voice breaking into a whimper that shattered the persona of the king. Because the moment you walked into the hall, the moment I smelled you, he shuddered, his nose brushing against her jawline, inhaling deeply again. My wolf went quiet, he whispered. For the first time in 10 years. The screaming in my head stopped. Lenara froze. And when you touched that handle? Draven continued, his voice rising in panic, his eyes wide and pleading. When I felt you trying to sever the proximity, it felt like you were ripping my ribs open. He moved one hand from the door, his trembling fingers coming up to touch her cheek. He touched her as if she were made of smoke, as if he was afraid she would dissipate. You aren't the replacement, Lenara, he breathed, the realization horror-struck and wholly all at once. Soraya was the mistake. Soraya was the test. His thumb traced her lower lip, his gaze dropping to her mouth, ravenous. You, he growled, the sound vibrating straight into her womb. You are the one the fire recognizes. Lenara stared at him, her world tilting on its axis. This wasn't duty. This wasn't a contract. Draven, she whispered. If you try to leave this room, he said, his voice dropping to a dark, possessive vow. I will burn this castle to the ground to find you. Do not try to walk away from me again. He leaned in, his lips hovering millimeters from hers, the air between them charged with a static that tasted of lightning. You are mine, he whispered into her mouth. God help me. You were always mine. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the loudest thing Lenara had ever heard. It wasn't the guards outside who had turned it. It was Draven. He stood with his back to the heavy oak door, his chest heaving, the iron key clenched in his fist so tightly that his knuckles were gay, white ridges against the dark metal. The room was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the ragged, harsh sound of his breathing. Lenara was still pressed against the wood, trapped between the hard surface of the door and the wall of muscle that was the king. She could feel the tremors running through his body fine, vibrating shudders like a machine pushed past its limit. You will not leave, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a command. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the terrifying certainty of a man who would fight the gods to make it true. Lenara's heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Draven, she whispered, her voice trembling. You are frightening me. The words seemed to pierce through the haze of his instinct. He blinked, the glowing gold in his eyes dimming just enough to reveal the amber human iris beneath. He looked down at her, and for a moment, she saw something that looked remarkably like panic. He stepped back. The sudden absence of his heat left her shivering. Draven turned away, pacing toward the fireplace, running a hand through his chaotic hair. I am not trying to frighten you, he rasped, staring into the flames. But you cannot leave this room. Not tonight, not tomorrow. Lenara straightened her cloak, clutching the edges together. She felt exposed, confused. Moments ago, he had claimed she was the one the fire recognized. Now, he was pacing like a warden. Am I a prisoner then? She asked, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. Is that what being a queen means in the north? To be locked away like a hoard of gold? Draven spun around, a growl ripping from his throat. No, you are not a prisoner. You are safe. He said the word as if it tasted foreign. You are here, where I can see you, where I can smell you. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, his hands flexing at his sides. If you go out there, he gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the rest of the castle, the bond. It stretches, it pulls. It felt like my veins were being drawn out of my body when you touched that handle. Lenara stared at him. She knew of fated mates, the stories the bards sang, full of romance and soft lighting. They spoke of instant love, of souls intertwining. They did not speak of this violence. this terrified, suffocating intensity. "You barely know me," she said softly. "Yesterday, I was a stranger. An hour ago, I was a burden. An hour ago, I was blind," he countered, his voice dropping. He looked at her across the room, his gaze heavy, physical. "I have spent 10 years surrounded by noise, Lenara. 10 years of the pack's voices, the council's demands, the screaming of the war in my own head. When you entered the hall, silence. Beautiful, cold silence." He walked over to the small table where a decanter of wine sat, pouring himself a glass with a shaking hand. He drank it in one swallow. "Take off the cloak," he said. Lenara stiffened. "My lord?" "Take it off," he repeated, his voice straining. "You are dressed to flee. Every time I look at that gray wool, I see you walking out into the snow. Take it off." Slowly, Lenara unclasped the cloak. She let it slide from her shoulders to the floor. She stood there, in her white undershift, her arms wrapped around herself. Draven exhaled, his shoulders dropping an inch. "Good. Now." The bed. Lenara's eyes widened. "I told you. Sleep," he interrupted, anticipating her fear. He walked to the massive armchair near the fire and sat down heavily, stretching his long legs out. He didn't look at the bed. He looked at the door, positioning himself as a living barricade. "I will stay here. I will not touch you. But you must sleep. And you must do it, where I can hear your heart beating." Lenara hesitated. She was exhausted, her body aching from the tension of the day. The bed looked soft, the furs inviting, and Draven, for all his terrifying intensity, he had placed himself as far away from her as the room allowed, guarding the exit rather than stalking her. She climbed into the massive bed, pulling the furs up to her chin. She expected to lie awake for hours, watching him. But the moment her head hit the pillow, a strange, heavy warmth settled over her. It was the scent of him, pine and smoke embedded in the sheets. It lulled her. The last thing she saw before her eyes drifted shut was the silhouette of the Wolf King, staring into the fire, keeping watch over his unwanted bride. Morning came with a pale gray light filtering through the snow-crusted windows. Lenara woke to the sound of low voices. She sat up, clutching the furs to her chest. Draven was standing by the door, fully dressed in fresh tunic and breeches. He was speaking to the captain of the guard, a scarred warrior named Kalen. The door was cracked open only an inch. "Double the patrol on the east wing," Draven was saying, his voice a low rumble. "And no one enters this suite. No one. Not the maids, not the cooks. If she requires food, it is to be left on the tray outside." "My king," Kalen sounded confused. "The council is gathering. They expect the queen to receive the morning blessing." "The queen is indisposed," Draven snapped. "She is resting. Tell the council if they wish to bless something, they can bless the empty chair." He slammed the door shut and turned the key. When he turned around, he froze, seeing Lenara sitting up. His face, which had been hard as granite, softened instantly. "You're awake," he said. He walked toward the bed, not stopping until his knees brushed the mattress. He looked tired. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept. "You locked the door," Lenara said, her voice hoarse. "I did. And you are keeping the servants out." "I am." Lenara pushed the hair back from her face. "Draven, I cannot stay in this room forever. I have duties. You have duties. My duty is to the pack," he said, leaning down, placing a hand on the bedpost, caging her in without touching her. "And right now my wolf believes that if you leave my sight, something will take you. It is irrational. I know this. But the instinct is roaring so loud I cannot hear myself think." He reached out, his hand hovering over her head. He looked like he wanted to pet her, to reassure himself she was solid. "I have to go to the council," he said, the words sounding like a confession of pain. "I have to leave the room." Lenara saw the struggle in his eyes. The separation anxiety of a fresh bond was legendary, but for an alpha of his power, one who had been starved of a mate for so long, it must be agonizing. "Go," she said softly. "I will be here when you return." He looked at her sharply. "You promise?" "Where would I go?" She gestured to the locked door. "You have made Thorngard a fortress." Draven didn't smile. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could feel the heat of him, smell the clean soap and the underlying musk of his skin. "I will return in 2 hours," he vowed. "Do not open the door for anyone." He turned and left, locking the door from the outside with a heavy thud. Lenara was alone. She rose and dressed in the only other gown that had been left in the room, a deep blue velvet that was, again, slightly too large. She moved through the suite, touching the cold stone walls, the tapestries, the iron poker by the fire. It was a beautiful room. It was a royal room, but as the hour stretched into 2, and then 3, the beauty began to fade. The silence pressed in on her. She went to the balcony, but the doors were locked. She tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. He had locked her in. Panic began to flutter in her chest. This isn't protection, she thought. This is possession. He doesn't see me as a partner. He sees me as a thing he finally found and is terrified to lose. She was pacing the length of the rug when she heard a sound at the main door. Not a key, a scratch. Queen. Lenara? A muffled voice called. Lenara rushed to the door. Yes? Who is it? It's Magda, the head housekeeper. The king. The king has been detained. He sent word that you are to eat. There was a grinding sound as a small hatch, at the bottom of the door usually used for guard dogs, was pushed open. A tray was slid through across the floorboards. Lenara stared at it. Cold meat, cheese, a flagon of water, like she was an animal in a kennel. Open the door, Lenara demanded, her indignation flaring hot. I wish to speak to you face to face. I cannot, Your Grace. The woman's voice was tight, nervous. The king has the only key. He took it with him. Lenara stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. He had taken the key. He had literally trapped her inside. She sank onto the floor beside the tray, the humiliation burning her throat. She wasn't a queen. She was a prisoner of his madness. It was dark when the lock finally turned again. Lenara was sitting in the high-backed chair by the dying fire. She hadn't eaten the food. She hadn't lit the lamps. She sat in the gloom, anger and fear coalescing into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. The door opened, and Draven burst in. He brought the wind with him, cold air, the scent of snow, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. He looked frantic. His eyes scanned the room, wild and darting, until they landed on her. Lenara, he breathed. He slammed the door and crossed the room in 3 strides. He fell to his knees before her chair, his hands gripping the armrests. You sat in the dark, he said, his voice rough. Why did you not light the lamps? Lenara looked down at him. He was covered in snow. There was a smear of blood on his cheek, not his own. I preferred the dark, she said icily. It suits the cell you have kept me in. Draven flinched. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling. I could not come back sooner. There was a dispute at the border. Rogues. I had to. He gestured to the border, blood on his face. I had to deal with it. You took the key, Lenara said. I had to make sure you were safe. Safe? Lenara stood up, forcing him to look up at her. You treated me like a dog, Draven. You slid food through a slot. Do you know what the court must be whispering? That the king has locked his mad wife away? Or that the king is so jealous he cannot trust her to walk the halls? Draven stood slowly. He towered over her, the shadows clinging to him. I do not care what they whisper, he growled. I care that you are breathing. I care that you are here. I am not an object, she shouted, pushing against his chest. It was like pushing a stone wall, but he let her shove him back a step. I am a person. I am a wolf, even if I have no shift. You cannot keep me in a box because you are afraid. I am not afraid, he roared back, the sound shaking the glass in the windows. You are terrified, Lenara screamed. Look at you. You are shaking. Silence crashed into the room. Draven stared at her, his chest heaving. The truth of her words hung between them. He was shaking. His hands, his jaw, his very soul seemed to be vibrating with a frequency that was tearing him apart. He closed his eyes, letting out a long, ragged breath. When he opened them, the gold was dull, swimming in moisture. It hurts, he whispered. The admission was so quiet Lenara almost missed it. What hurts? She asked, her anger faltering. Draven took her hand. He didn't pull her. He just pressed her palm against the center of his chest, right over his heart. It wasn't beating. It was thundering. A chaotic, frantic rhythm that felt like it was trying to break his ribs. Here, he said. And here. He touched his temple. When I am away from you, it is a physical agony. It feels like the bond is being cauterized. Like I am bleeding out. He looked at her, his expression open, raw, stripped of all kingly pretense. I know I am trapping you, he admitted, his voice thick with shame. I No, this is madness. But Lenara, when I was fighting today, when the blood was in the air, the only thing that kept the wolf from taking over completely was the knowledge that you were behind that door, that you were safe. He sank down onto the rug again, resting his forehead against her waist. It was a gesture of supreme submission. The Alpha King, kneeling at the feet of the unwanted Omega. "Help me," he whispered into the velvet of her dress. "I do not know how to do this. I do not know how to have this fire inside me without burning everything down." Lenara looked down at him. She felt the heat of his forehead through the fabric. She felt the desperation in his grip on her hips. This wasn't the arrogance of a tyrant. This was the vulnerability of a creature who had been alone in the dark for so long that the light was blinding him. Slowly, tentatively, Lenara reached out. Her fingers brushed through his dark hair, scratching lightly against his scalp. Draven let out a sound, a half sob, half purr, and pressed harder into her. The tension in his shoulders began to bleed away. The frantic rhythm of his heart under her other hand began to slow, syncing with hers. "We cannot go on like this," she said softly, continuing to stroke his hair. "You cannot be my jailer, Draven." "I know," he mumbled. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "I leave this room. You can come with me. You can surround me with guards. But I will walk out of that door on my own 2 feet." Draven went still. He stayed silent for a long time, soaking in her touch, his breathing evening out. Finally, he looked up. His eyes were clear amber again. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "But tonight, let me keep the door locked, just for tonight." Lenara looked at the heavy door, then back at the man kneeling before her. She realized then that the cage wasn't for her, it was for him. He needed the walls to keep his own sanity contained. "Just for tonight," she whispered. Draven rose, lifting her, effortlessly, into his arms. He carried her to the bed, but this time, he didn't retreat to the chair. He lay down beside her, on top of the covers, fully clothed, his back to the door and his face buried in the curve of her neck. He wrapped an arm around her waist, a heavy iron weight that anchored her to the mattress. "Mine," he murmured into her skin, the word vibrating through her body. Lenara lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. She was trapped, she was burdened. But as the king's breathing slowed into sleep, and his warmth seeped into her cold bones, she realized she was no longer the second choice. She was the only thing keeping the monster at bay, and that was a far more dangerous place to be. The promise of freedom was a heavy thing. Lenara stood before the tall mirror in the dressing room, the morning light cruel and bright against her pale skin. The maids had dressed her in black and silver, the colors of House Morick. The gown was structured, high-collared, and severe, meant to project power. But Lenara felt less like a queen and more like a child playing dress-up in a warrior's armor. "You look regal. Your Grace," one of the maids murmured, adjusting a pin in Lenara's hair. The girl's eyes darted away, unable to hold Lenara's gaze. Even the servants knew. Everyone knew. The door to the suite opened. Draven filled the frame. He had traded his chaotic, shirt-sleeve desperation of the night before for the cold, hard polish of the king. He wore a tunic of charcoal wool, a heavy chain of iron links across his chest, and his sword strapped to his hip. His hair was pulled back, revealing the sharp angles of his face and the white scar that bisected his collar. He stopped when he saw her. The air in the room shifted instantly. The pressure drop was palpable, a physical weight that made the maids scurry back, heads bowed. Draven didn't speak to them. He walked straight to Lenara, his boots heavy on the stone floor. He stopped behind her, his eyes finding hers in the reflection of the mirror. He looked calm, but Lenara could feel the hum of him, a low-frequency vibration, like a generator running just beneath the floorboards. He reached out, his large hands settling on her shoulders. The heat of his palms seeped through the heavy velvet of her gown, branding her. "You are pale," he said, his voice low. "I am nervous," Lenara admitted, watching his reflection. "The council, the court, they will be watching." "Let them watch," Draven growled, his thumbs digging slightly into her muscles. "Let them see that you are still breathing. Let them see that I have not torn you apart." He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Stay close to me. If you drift more than an arm's length away, I cannot promise I will not cause a scene." It was a warning, but it sounded like a plea. "I will stay close," she whispered. He offered her his arm. It was stiff, hard as rock. She laid her hand upon it, feeling the tension in his forearm. Together, they walked out of the sanctuary of the suite and into the lion's den. The great hall was prepared for the midwinter feast. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, winter root vegetables, and flagons of dark northern ale. The air was thick with the smell of rosemary, searing fat, and the musk of 300 wolves. When the herald announced them King Draven and Queen Lenara of the High North, the room went silent. It wasn't the respectful silence of subjects greeting their monarch. It was the hungry, curious silence of a pack, assessing a weakness. They walked the length of the hall to the high table. Lenara kept her chin up, fixing her eyes on the empty throne beside Draven's. She could feel the gazes raking over her. Assessing her hips, too narrow. Her scent, too faint. Her aura, non-existent. They reached the dais. Draven pulled out her chair himself, a breach of protocol that caused a ripple of whispers. He didn't sit until she was settled. When he took his own seat, he shifted his heavy chair closer to hers, the wood screeching against the stone, until their elbows were touching. The feast began. It was an ordeal of noise and feigned laughter. Lords and ladies came to pay their respects, bowing low, offering hollow congratulations. Draven was terse with them, his hand resting visibly on the table, inches from Lenara's, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, agitated beat. Lenara picked at her food. She felt like an imposter at her own wedding feast. Then, the great doors at the far end of the hall groaned open again. The sound was different this time. Louder, more deliberate. A hush swept over the room, starting from the back and rolling forward like a tide. The music died. The clatter of cutlery stopped. Lenara looked up. Standing in the archway, framed by the snowy night outside, was a vision of gold. She wore a cloak of white fur that looked soft as clouds, draped over a matter's gown of shimmering gold silk that clung to every curve. Her hair was a cascade of spun sunlight, falling to her waist in loose, perfect waves. She was tall, statuesque, and radiant. It was Lady Soraya, the first choice. Lenara's heart stopped. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. Soraya didn't look ashamed. She didn't look like a woman who had fled the kingdom in disgrace. She looked like a queen returning from a long journey. She glided into the hall, followed by a small retinue of servants carrying chests. She walked with a confidence that Lenara had never possessed, the confidence of a woman who knows she is desired. The silence in the hall was absolute. Every eye darted from Soraya to Draven, waiting for the explosion. Lenara felt Draven go rigid beside her. It wasn't fear. It was a sudden violent spike of aggression. His scent flared acrid, burning ozone so strong it made Lenara cough. His hand on the table curled into a fist, the knuckles cracking audibly. Soraya reached the base of the dais. She sank into a curtsy that was graceful, deep, and entirely mocking. "My king," she purred. Her voice was like warm honey, carrying effortlessly to the rafters. "I heard of the sudden union. I traveled through the storm to offer my humblest felicitations." She rose, her blue eyes locking onto Draven's face, ignoring Lenara completely. "I feared you would be lonely," Soraya said, her lips curving into a smile that was both intimate and cruel. "I see you have filled the vacancy." The insult was subtle, wrapped in silk, but it struck Lenara with the force of a slap. Vacancy. As if Lenara was a piece of furniture brought in to fill an empty corner. Draven slowly stood up. He loomed over the table, his shadow falling across Soraya. "You have no business in Blackwood, Soraya," Draven said. His voice was a grinder of rocks. "You forfeited your place in this hall the night you boarded that ship." Soraya laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound. "Oh, Draven, don't be so dramatic. We both know why I left. I was not ready to be caged. But I hear the cage has been opened." She took a step up the dais stairs. The guards tensed, but Draven held up a hand to stop them. "And this," Soraya finally turned her gaze to Lenara. Her eyes swept over the Omega, dismissing her in a single second. "This is the little Quillen girl? The one whose wolf never sings?" The shame burned hot in Lenara's cheeks. It was true. Her wolf had been silent since she was a child, a defect that made her an object of pity in a society that worshipped strength. "She is your queen," Draven snarled, the sound vibrating in his chest. "You will address her as such." "Queen?" Soraya tilted her head. "A title is just a word, Draven. A bond." She touched her own chest, looking back at him. A true connection is forged in fire, not signed on parchment because the council demanded an heir. She was rewriting history. She was claiming a bond that didn't exist, playing on the court's memory of their courtship. And the terrible thing was, the court was eating it up. Lenara could see the nods, the sympathetic glances toward the star-crossed lovers. Lenara felt small, microscopic. She looked at Draven, waiting for him to roar, to throw Soraya out, to claim Lenara as his true mate. But Draven was frozen. He was staring at Soraya, his face a mask of tortured conflict. To the court, it looked like longing. To Lenara, who was sitting in the blast radius of his aura, it felt like confusion. His instincts were screaming. The proximity of his new mate and the presence of the woman his mind had obsessed over for a year were clashing, causing a sensory overload that paralyzed him. He didn't defend her. Not really. He just stood there, vibrating. "I have brought a gift," Soraya said, signaling to her servants. They opened a chest, revealing a magnificent sword with a hilt of gold and ruby. "For the king. A reminder of the summer we spent in the sunburst. Isles." She stepped forward and placed the sword on the table, her hand lingering near Draven's. "I am staying in the East Wing," she said softly. "For old time's sake, Draven. Do not turn me away into the snow." Draven looked at the sword, then at Soraya. Then finally he glanced down at Lenara. His eyes were chaotic, swirling with that mad gold. He looked like a man drowning. "Stay," he rasped. "If you wish, but keep out of my sight." It was a dismissal, but it was weak. It was permission. Soraya smiled. A victor's smile. "As you wish, my lord." She turned and walked away, the crowd parting for her as if she were the true queen. Lenara sat frozen. He had let her stay. The woman who had broken him, the woman the kingdom wanted him to be with, he had let her stay under the same roof. Lenara looked at her hands resting in her lap. They looked pale and useless. She felt the bond, that fragile, thin thread that had connected her to Draven, go cold. It wasn't that he had severed it. It was that she was retreating. Inside her, deep in the spiritual cavity where her wolf resided, Lenara felt a shift. Her wolf, usually a quiet, dormant presence, let out a sound. It was a whimper, a sound of pure, distilled rejection. And then, the wolf turned away. It was a sensation Lenara had heard of but never felt. The fading, when an Omega's spirit, broken by rejection or shame, simply stops. It curls in on itself, severing connections to the outside world to protect the core. The sounds of the banquet hall became muffled, as if Lenara were underwater. The heat of Draven's body beside her, which had been so overwhelming moments ago, seemed to drift away. She stood up. The movement was sudden enough that Draven snapped his head toward her. "Lenara?" he said, his voice sharp. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at him, she would scream, and she had enough dignity left not to scream in front of Soraya. "I am unwell," she said. Her voice sounded strange, flat, hollow. "I am retiring." "I will come with you," Draven said immediately, reaching for her arm. Lenara stepped back. The movement was smooth, avoiding his touch. "No," she said. Draven froze, his hand hovering in midair. "No? Stay," she said, gesturing vaguely to the hall, to the sword on the table, to the golden woman holding court near the wine barrels. "Stay with your guests. Stay with your memories." "Lenara, don't," he growled, the panic rising in his voice again. "You know that is not—" "I know what I see," she whispered, "and I know what I am." She turned and walked away. She expected him to follow. She expected the roar, the slammed doors, the primal demand that she return to his side. She braced herself for his wolf to crash into the barrier between them, but he didn't follow. Draven stood paralyzed at the high table, trapped between the expectations of his court, the confusion of his instincts, and the ghost of the woman he thought he loved. Lenara walked the long, lonely path down the center of the hall. The silence was deafening. She could feel Soraya's eyes on her back, burning like a brand. The safe choice. The replacement. She reached the heavy double doors and pushed them open. The cold air of the corridor hit her face, but she didn't shiver. She felt numb. She walked blindly, not toward the royal suite. She couldn't go back there. That room smelled of him. It smelled of the lie that she was his anchor. She turned left, toward the older, draftier wing of the castle, the wing where the nursery had once been, now abandoned and covered in dust sheets. She found a small room with a window overlooking the frozen cliffs. There was no fire, no furniture except a wooden bench. Lenara sat down on the hard wood. She pulled her knees to her chest. Inside her chest, the silence grew louder. The heartbeat of her wolf slowed, rhythmic and fading, like a clock winding down. She closed her eyes. I accept, she thought, surrendering to, I the cold. I accept that I am nothing. And in the great hall, amidst the feasting and the gold, the Alpha King suddenly doubled over, clutching his chest, a roar of agony tearing from his throat as he felt the light in his soul flicker and go out. The morning sun did not rise over Thorngard. It merely bruised the gray sky with a dull, sickly purple. In the council chamber, the air was thick enough to choke on. The 12 high lords of the north sat around the circular stone table, their faces grim, their furs heavy. At the head of the table, Alpha King Draven Morik paced like a caged animal, his boots slamming against the floorboards with a violence that made the water in the goblets tremble. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, his eyes rimmed with red. He hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten. Since the moment Lenara had walked out of the great hall the night before, a terrifying silence had settled in his chest. The bond, that frantic, burning tether that had screamed at him for 2 days had gone quiet. It wasn't gone. It was worse. It was fading. It felt like a limb that had fallen asleep. A heavy, prickling numbness that was slowly spreading toward his heart. She is not fit. Lord Vane, a grizzled elder with a scar across his nose, slammed his fist on the table. Look at the facts, Draven. She left the feast. She hides in the old nursery. She has no wolf. She is an Omega who cannot even bear the weight of the crown's gaze, let alone the crown's enemies. She is my mate, Draven snarled, stopping his pacing to glare at the old wolf. If you speak against her again, Vane, I will rip your tongue out. Is she? A smooth, melodic voice cut through the tension. Lady Soraya stood near the window. She wasn't a council member, but her influence was a poison that had seeped deep into the roots of the court. She wore riding leathers today, looking every inch the warrior queen she claimed to be. If she were your true mate, Draven, Soraya said softly, turning to face him, you wouldn't be looking so diminished. A true bond strengthens an alpha. This, she gestured to his shaking hands. This is a parasite draining you. She is weak, and her weakness is killing you. Get out, Draven whispered, the gold in his eyes flickering dangerously. I only speak the truth, Soraya sighed. The North cannot have a weak queen. Winter is coming. The rogues are gathering at the southern border. We need strength. The law is clear, Lord Vane interjected, seizing the opening Soraya had provided. If the queen's fitness is in question, she must prove herself. She must undertake the trial of the White Pine. Draven froze. The trial is a hunt. It is for warriors. She is an Omega. It is for queens, Vane corrected. The first Morik queen hunted the great white stag. If she is of the North will protect her. If she is not, the North will cull her. I forbid it, Draven roared, slamming his hands onto the table. I will not. Send her into the woods to die for your amusement. You have no choice, Vane roared back, standing up. Unless you wish to abdicate. Unless you wish to admit that you chose a broken thing over the good of the pack. The doors to the chamber creaked open. The argument died instantly. Lenara stood there. She wore the same gray wool cloak she had tried to flee in 2 nights ago. Her face was pale, translucent as ice, and her eyes were dark, hollow voids. She looked like a ghost who hadn't realized she was dead yet. She didn't look at Draven. She didn't look at Soraya. She looked at the empty center of the table. I will do it, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a gavel strike. Draven moved toward her, stumbling slightly as the numbness in his chest spiked. Lenara, no. You do not know what they are asking. They are asking if I am worthy, she said, finally lifting her eyes to his. There was nothing in them. No anger, no fear, no love, just a vast, snowy emptiness. And I am tired, Draven. I am tired of the whispers. I am tired of being the mistake. You are not a mistake, he pleaded, reaching for her. He needed to touch her. He needed to jumpstart the bond, to feel the fire again. She stepped back. The trial of the White Pine, she said to Lord Vane. When does it begin? Vane looked surprised by her resolve, but he nodded grimly. At high noon. You will be given a bow and a knife. You must return with a kill before sunset. If you return empty-handed, you return as an exile. And if I do not return at all? Lenara asked. Soraya smiled from the corner, a small, cruel thing. Then the king is free. Lenara nodded. Acceptable. Lenara, Draven grabbed her shoulders then, ignoring the gasp of the council. "Stop this. I can end this. I will banish them all. I will burn the laws." She looked up at him, and for a second, he saw the heartbreak beneath the ice. "You cannot burn the truth, Draven. You want her. Everyone wants her. Let the forest decide." She pulled away from him. The loss of contact made him stagger physically. "I will be ready at noon," she said, and she turned and walked away. The stables were bustling with activity. The trial was not a private affair. It was a spectacle. The court had gathered, wrapped in furs, eager to see the false queen fail. Draven was legally forbidden from participating in the hunt. He was forbidden from stepping foot in the woods until the sun touched the horizon. It was an ancient rule designed to ensure the queen didn't rely on the king's strength. He stood on the battlements, his knuckles white as he gripped the icy stone, watching the courtyard below. He saw Lenara mount a white mare. She looked impossibly small. They had given her a bow that looked too heavy for her arms, and a quiver of arrows. Soraya was there, mounted on a black stallion. She wasn't participating in the trial, but she was leading the honor guard that would ride to the edge of the forest. Draven's wolf was howling in his head. Protect, claim, save. But the human part of him was paralyzed by the crushing weight of the law and the terrifying apathy he had seen in Lenara's eyes. She wasn't fighting to live. She was fighting to end it, one way or another. The horn blew, a low, mournful sound that echoed off the mountains. Lenara didn't look back at the castle. She kicked her horse into a gallop and disappeared into the tree line. The forest was silent. The ancient pines of the high north were giants, their branches heavy with snow, blocking out most of the weak sunlight. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, freezing the moisture in Lenara's nose with every breath. She rode for an hour, deeper and deeper into the wilds. She wasn't looking for game. She was just riding. The cold felt good. It matched the cold inside her. The numbness of the bond was a relief after the agonizing hope of the first night. She realized now that Draven's reaction, his madness, hadn't been love. It had been instinct. Biology. He was an alpha reacting to a proximity trigger. It meant nothing against the history he had with Soraya. "Let the winter take me," she thought. "It is a cleaner death than fading away in the corner of his palace." Her mare whinnied nervously, its ears flicking back. Lenara pulled on the reins. "Easy," she whispered. The woods had changed. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was predatory. She slid off the horse, tying the reins to a sapling. She needed to hunt. If she was going to die, she would die trying. She was a Quillen. She wouldn't give Soraya the satisfaction of finding her frozen on the back of a horse. She unslung the bow. It was heavy, the wood stiff from the cold. She pulled an arrow from the quiver. A twig snapped. Lenara spun around, drawing the bowstring. Her arms shook, but she held it. Nothing, just the wind shifting the snow. She moved forward, stepping carefully over the roots, hidden beneath the white powder. She tracked the prints of a snow hare, but her mind was wandering. She heard a sound, a low, chuffing noise to her left. She turned, raising the bow. From the shadows of a dense thicket, a wolf emerged. But it wasn't a shifter. It was a timber wolf, a feral beast, huge and gray, with yellow eyes that held no intelligence, only hunger. And it wasn't alone. Two more slid out from behind the trees, flanking her. Lenara's heart hammered. This was it. She aimed at the lead wolf. She took a breath, anchored her stance, and released the string. Snap. The bowstring didn't just release, it shattered. The twine snapped in the middle with a sound like a whip crack, lashing back and slicing Lenara's cheek. The arrow flopped harmlessly into the snow at her feet. Lenara stared at the broken bow in horror. The string had been cut. Not all the way, just enough that the tension of a full draw would snap it. Soraya. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a trial. It was an execution. The lead wolf didn't wait for her to process the betrayal. It lunged. Lenara threw the useless bow at its face and scrambled backward, drawing the hunting knife from her belt. The wolf crashed into her, its weight driving the air from her lungs. Jaws snapped inches from her throat. She screamed, jamming her forearm into the beast's neck to hold it back. The thick wool of her cloak protected her skin, but the pressure was crushing. She stabbed blindly with the knife, the blade sinking into the wolf's shoulder. The wolf yelped and rolled off, snarling. Lenara scrambled to her feet, gasping. Blood red and hot stained the pristine snow. The other two wolves were circling now. They smelled the blood. They smelled the fear. "Come on," Lenara screamed, her voice raw, tears freezing on her face. "Finish it." But inside, something flickered. The apathy cracked. The desire to sleep, to fade, to let the cold win. It vanished, replaced by a sudden, white-hot spark of rage. No. She was the second choice. She was the replacement. She was the unwanted bride. But I am not meat. She gripped the knife, her knuckles white. She wasn't going to die here. She wasn't going to let Soraya win. The lead wolf, wounded but furious, crouched to spring. Back in the castle, Draven was on his knees in the center of the council chamber. The lords were watching him with a mixture of fear and awe. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was staring at the floor, sweat pouring off his face despite the chill. "My king?" Kaelin, the captain, stepped forward cautiously. Draven's head snapped up. His eyes were gone. There was no amber, no white, just pools of liquid, terrified gold. "She is bleeding," he whispered. The voice didn't sound human. It sounded like tectonic plates grinding together. "The sun is not down," Lord Vane warned, backing away. "You cannot interfere. The law states, fuck the law." The shout shattered the windows. Glass rained down onto the table. Draven stood up. As he did, the air around him warped. His bones cracked, a sickening, wet sound that echoed in the room. He didn't bother to strip. He didn't bother to walk to the door. He shifted. It was a violent, explosive transformation. One moment he was a man. The next, a massive midnight black wolf stood in the center of the room, shredding his clothes, his tunic hanging in tatters around his massive shoulders. The wolf the render was twice the size of a normal alpha. His fur was pitch black, darker than the shadows. His eyes were burning coals. He looked at Lord Vane and let out a roar that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. Then, he turned and charged. Not at the door, at the balcony. He leaped, crashing through the stone balustrade, plummeting 3 stories down into the courtyard below. He landed with a thud that cracked the cobblestones, gathered his legs beneath him, and launched himself toward the forest gate. He was a black streak of death against the white snow. He ran faster than a horse, faster than the wind. He could feel her. He could feel the terror. He could feel the sharp bite of the cold. And he could feel her rage waking up like a dragon in a cave. "Hold on!" He roared into the mental link, forcing the words down the withered bond. "I am coming. I am coming." Lenara was backed against a rock face. Her cloak was shredded. Her left arm was useless, bitten deep, blood soaking the gray wool. The knife was gone, knocked from her hand in the last scuffle. The 3 wolves were wary now. They had underestimated the small female. One lay dead in the snow, its throat slit by a lucky strike, but the other 2 were closing in. Lenara was dizzy. The loss of blood was making the world tilt. So this is it, she thought. She looked up at the sky through the branches. The sun was beginning to dip. One of the wolves, the larger one, lowered its head and snarled. It tensed its hind legs. Lenara closed her eyes, and then the world exploded. A black blur crashed out of the tree line. It hit the attacking wolf with the force of a freight train. There was a sickening crunch of bone, a yelp that was cut short, and then silence. Lenara opened her eyes. Standing over her was a monster, a wolf of nightmares, massive and black, with fur that seemed to absorb the light. It stood over the broken body of the timber wolf, its chest heaving. The 3rd timber wolf took one look at the apex predator, tucked its tail, and fled into the woods. The black wolf didn't chase it. Slowly, terrifyingly, it turned to face Lenara. Its muzzle was wet with blood. Its teeth were bared. It was growling, a low, continuous sound that vibrated in Lenara's bones. Lenara pressed herself against the rock, trembling. She knew this wolf. She had seen it in the stained glass. She had heard the stories. Draven. But he didn't look like a husband. He looked like a beast lost to the madness. His eyes were wild, scanning her, focusing on the blood dripping from her arm. He took a step toward her. "Draven," she whispered. He growled louder, snapping his jaws at the air. He was fighting himself. The bloodlust was high, the instinct to kill everything in the vicinity overwhelming. He moved closer, looming over her until his shadow swallowed her whole. He lowered his massive head, sniffing her injured arm. Lenara didn't breathe. One bite, and her arm would be gone. But he didn't bite. He let out a high-pitched whine, a sound so at odds with his size it broke Lenara's heart. He began to lick the wound. Rough, frantic laps of his tongue, cleaning the blood, sealing the skin with his saliva. He pushed his face into her neck, whining, nudging her, checking her for other breaks. He was frantic, checking her legs, her ribs, pushing her with his nose. Safe, safe, mine, bleeding. Who did this? Kill them. The voice wasn't spoken. It smashed into her mind, a telepathic roar that nearly knocked her. Unconscious. The bond had snapped open. It wasn't a trickle anymore. It was a floodgate. Lenara gasped, clutching her head as Draven's emotions poured into her. Not pity, not duty, pure, unadulterated terror, and a love so violent, so possessing, it felt like being burned alive. Draven shifted. It was ugly. He forced the change, bones snapping back into human shape, leaving him kneeling in the snow, naked, shivering, covered in the blood of the wolf he had just killed. He grabbed her face with both hands, smearing blood on her cheeks. "Who touched the bow?" He screamed at her, his eyes manic. "Who touched the bow? Lenara?" Lenara stared at him, shaking. "The string." It snapped. "It was cut." Draven roared, looking at the broken weapon in the snow. "I smell the oil. I smell the blade on the string." He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his arms around her so tight she couldn't breathe. He rocked her back and forth in the snow. "They tried to kill you," he sobbed, pressing, his face into her bloody hair. "They tried to take you." He looked up at the sky, where the sun was finally setting. "I will kill them," he vowed, his voice dropping to a demon's whisper. "I will kill them all." The return to Thorngard was a cortege of fury. Draven carried Lenara the entire way. He refused the horse. He refused the cloak offered by a terrified guard who had met them at the tree line. He walked barefoot through the snow, naked save for the shredded remnants of his breeches, clutching his wife against his chest as if she were the last ember of a dying fire. His skin was burning hot, warding off the winter chill for both of them. Lenara, drifting in and out of consciousness from the blood loss, could feel the thundering of his heart against her cheek. It wasn't just beating, it was counting down. When they reached the castle courtyard, silence fell like an axe. The nobles who had gathered to watch the outcome of the trial stood frozen. They had expected a corpse. They had expected a shamed Omega returning in failure. Instead, they saw their king, covered in blood that was not his own, carrying a woman who looked less like a queen and more like a sacrifice that had refused to die. Draven didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge the council members who rushed forward, babbling about laws and protocols. He walked straight through them, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance that only he could see. "Get the healers," he snarled as he passed Kaelin. "And lock the gates. No one leaves. No one enters." "My king," Kaelin stammered, looking at Lenara's limp form. "The Lady Soraya. She is asking to see you." Draven stopped. The motion was so abrupt that Lenara's head lolled against his shoulder. She groaned, a soft sound of pain. At the sound, Draven's entire body convulsed. He looked at Kaelin, and for a moment, the captain of the guard took a step back, hand going to his sword hilt instinctively. The king looked inhuman. "Tell Soraya," Draven whispered, his voice carrying a terrible calm, "that if she steps out of her chambers, I will not be responsible for what happens to her." He turned and marched up the stone steps, leaving a trail of bloody footprints on the pristine white marble. The royal suite smelled of iron and antiseptic. 3 healers worked on Lenara's arm. The bite was deep, dangerously close to the bone, but the artery was intact. They stitched the flesh with hands that trembled under the king's gaze. Draven stood by the fireplace. He had washed the blood from his face but refused to dress. He wore only loose trousers, his chest bare, revealing the scars of his past wars. But it was the fresh scars that were terrifying scratch marks on his own arms, where he had clawed at himself during the transformation. He was pacing, always pacing. "The fever is rising," the head healer, an elderly woman named Martha, murmured, placing a cool cloth on Lenara's forehead. "It is the infection from the bite, and the shock. Her wolf is too weak to heal it quickly." "Fix it," Draven said from the shadows. "We are doing our best, sire. But she needs rest. Quiet. She needs her mate," Lenara whispered. The room went still. Lenara's eyes were open. They were glassy, fever-bright, but she was lucid. She looked past the healers, straight at the man lurking in the dark. "Leave us," Draven commanded. "Sire, the bandages. Leave us." The healers scrambled, gathering their basins and cloths. fleeing the room as if the devil himself had snapped his fingers. The door clicked shut. Draven didn't move toward the bed. He stayed by the fire, gripping the mantle. "You shouldn't be near me," he said, his voice ragged. "I am unstable." "You saved me," Lenara said. Her voice was weak, but the apathy was gone. In its place was a quiet, steady ember of defiance. "I broke the law," he countered bitterly. "I entered the woods before sunset. By rights, I have forfeited the crown. They cut the bowstring. Draven." He flinched. He turned to look at her, his face a mask of anguish. "I know. I smelled the oil on your hands when I picked you up. It was Soraya," Lenara said. "It wasn't a question." Draven closed his eyes. "I know, and yet she is still in the castle. Because if I go to her now..." Draven opened his eyes, and the gold was swirling again. "I will kill her. I will tear her throat out in front of the court. And then the Southern Pack will declare war, and thousands will die because I couldn't control my temper." He walked toward the bed, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her bandaged arm, then at her face. "I failed you," he whispered. "I brought her here. I let her stay. I let them send you into the woods." He sank to his knees. For the second time in their short marriage, the Wolf King was on the floor. But this wasn't submission. This was collapse. "I thought..." He choked on the words. "I thought I still loved her. I thought the bond with you was just biology. A trick of the heat." He reached out, his fingers hovering over her uninjured hand. "But when you left on that horse," he said, looking up at her, tears tracking through the soot on his face, "it felt like my soul was being ripped out of my body. I didn't chase you because of duty, Lenara. I chased you because a world without you in it is just ash." Lenara looked at him. This man, this powerful, broken creature. "Then prove it," she said softly. Draven froze. "What?" "The bond," Lenara said. "It's weak. It's fading. My wolf, she turned away from you at the feast. She doesn't trust you." She lifted her hand, the one he was afraid to touch, and laid it on his cheek. "If you want me to stay," she whispered, "you have to bring her back. You have to bridge the gap." Draven leaned into her touch, a shudder running through him. "How?" "Show me," she said. "Show me what you felt in the woods. Don't tell me. Show me." She lowered her mental barriers. It was a dangerous thing to do with. An alpha in such a volatile state. It invited his psyche to crash into hers. But Lenara was tired of words. Words lied. Soraya used words like weapons. Draven understood. He took a sharp breath. He placed his hand over hers on his cheek, and he pushed. The connection slammed into place. It wasn't a gentle stream of affection. It was a tsunami. Lenara gasped, her back arching off the mattress as Draven's emotions flooded her system. She felt the cold of the woods. She felt the terror of seeing the empty saddle. She felt the red, blinding rage when he smelled her blood. But beneath that, beneath the violence and the fear, there was something else. A vast, deep ocean of need. It was a loneliness so profound it echoed. For 10 years, he had been a king, a warrior, a leader, but he had been hollow. And then, in the chapel, he had seen her small, terrified, resolute, and the hollow had filled with light. She felt his guilt. It was a heavy, suffocating stone in his chest. Guilt for Aspat, looking at Soraya. Guilt for making Lenara feel second best. And then, she felt the truth. Soraya was a golden statue. Beautiful, cold, hard. Lenara was the hearth fire. Warm, vital, necessary. "You are not the replacement," his voice echoed in her mind, clear and ringing. "You are the cure." Lenara let out a sob. The tears came hot and fast. Her wolf, sensing the sincerity, sensing the raw vulnerability of the alpha, stirred from its slumber. It didn't roar. It didn't howl. It simply stepped forward in the darkness of her soul and laid its head on its paws, watching him, waiting. Draven pulled back, breaking the mental link with a gasp. He slumped forward, resting his forehead on the mattress beside her hip. "I am sorry," he wept. "I am so sorry." Lenara stroked his hair. The fever was still burning in her blood, but the cold in her heart was gone. "I believe you," she whispered. "But Draven, believing is not enough. We are still in danger." Draven lifted his head. His eyes were clear now. The madness had receded, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "Yes," he said. He stood up, the motion fluid and lethal. "We are." He walked to the wardrobe and pulled out a fresh tunic. He dressed quickly, strapping his sword belt around his waist. He looked like the king again, but different, harder. There was no hesitation in his movements. "Where are you going?" Lenara asked, fear spiking. "To finish the trial," he said. "Draven, you can't kill her." "I'm not going to kill her," he said, walking to the door. He paused, his hand on the latch. He looked back at her. "Death is too easy for what she did. I am going to do something far worse." "What?" "I am going to let her speak." The council chamber was full again. It was midnight, but no one was sleeping. The castle was in lockdown. Draven kicked the doors open. He strode to the head of the table. He didn't sit. He stood, radiating a power that made the candles flicker. "Bring her in," he commanded. 2 guards dragged Lady Soraya into the room. She wasn't in chains, but she looked disheveled. Her golden hair was messy, her eyes wide with indignation. "This is an outrage," she shrieked, shaking off the guards. "I am a guest. I am a noble of the Southern Isles. You cannot treat me like a criminal." "You are not a guest," Draven said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are an assassin." He threw the broken bow onto the table. It clattered loudly, sliding across the wood to stop in front of Lord Vane. "Inspect it," Draven ordered. Vane picked up the bow. He ran a thumb over the frayed string. He sniffed it. His face paled. "Oil of nightshade," Vane whispered. "It weakens the fiber. It snaps under tension." "And who had access to the armory this morning?" Draven asked, his eyes fixed on Soraya. "I was nowhere near the armory," Soraya spat. "You are looking for a scapegoat because your little Omega couldn't handle a wolf." "We have witnesses." Kaelin stepped forward from the shadows. The stable boy saw. "Your maid, Vea, entering the armory an hour before the hunt." Soraya's face twitched. "Just a fraction, but it was enough." "Vea is a fool," Soraya said quickly. "If she did something, she did it on her own." "Did she?" Draven walked around the table, closing the distance between them. "Or did she do it because she was promised a place in the new queen's court?" He stopped in front of her. The court held its breath. This was the moment. The love of his life versus the wife he was forced to take. "You left me, Soraya," Draven said softly. "You left because you wanted power, and you thought the South offered more of it. You came back because you heard I had taken a mate, and your vanity couldn't stand the idea of someone else sitting on your throne. I came back for you," Soraya cried, reaching for his hand. "Draven, look at me. Remember us. Remember the fire." Draven looked at her hand, then he looked at her eyes. "I remember," he said. "I remember that you never asked about the pack. I remember that you never visited the sick. I remember that you loved the crown, not the king." He stepped back, avoiding her touch. "There is no fire here, Soraya. Just ash." He turned to the council. "Lenara Quillen survived the trial," he announced, his voice booming. "She faced the wolves. She bled for this house, and she was betrayed by one of our own guests. The punishment for sabotage of a royal trial is death," Lord Vane said, his voice trembling. "No," Draven said. "I will not stain my floor with her blood." He looked at Soraya, who was now pale, realizing the charm was broken. "You are exiled," Draven pronounced. "Not just from Thorngard, from the north. If your foot touches the snow of my kingdom after sunrise, you will be hunted down like the rogue you are." "You can't do this," Soraya screamed. "I am the true queen. The stars said so." "The stars are silent," Draven said coldly. "Get her out of my sight." The guards seized her. Soraya screamed, thrashing, cursing Lenara's name, cursing Draven's weakness. Her voice echoed down the corridor until the heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off the noise. Silence returned to the chamber. Draven looked at the High Lords. They looked back, uncertain, fearful. They had seen their king choose the weak Omega over the golden perfection of Soraya. They had seen him break the law to save her. "Does anyone else question the queen's fitness?" Draven asked softly. No one spoke. "Good," Draven said. "Then we have a war to prepare for. Because Soraya will not go quietly. She will run to the south, and she will tell them we are vulnerable." He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward. "Let them come," he growled. "Let them see what happens when they threaten what is mine." Later that night, Draven returned to the suite. Lenara was asleep. The fever had broken, her skin cool and damp. He sat in the chair by the bed, watching her chest rise and fall. He was exhausted, his body aching from the shift and the stress. But he felt clear. For the first time in years, the noise in his head was gone. Lenara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. She saw him watching her. "Is she gone?" she whispered. "She is gone," Draven said. "And the council? They are terrified, as they should be." Lenara managed a weak smile. She reached out her hand. Draven took it. He brought her knuckles to his lips, kissing them reverently. "Rest now, my queen," he murmured. "The storm is over." But as he watched the firelight dance on the walls, Draven knew the storm wasn't over. It was just changing direction. Soraya was vengeful, and the south was hungry. But for tonight, holding Lenara's hand, he didn't care. The fire was here, and he would burn the world before he let it go out again. The raven arrived 3 days after Soraya's exile. It was not a messenger bird of the north, strong, white-feathered and silent. This was a southern scavenger, black as pitch, with a cylinder of gold tied to its leg. It landed on the balcony of the royal suite, pecking aggressively at the glass, until Draven opened the door and crushed its neck in one swift motion. Lenara watched from the bed. She was sitting up now, her arm in a sling, the color slowly returning to her cheeks. But the sight of the king killing the bird made her stomach turn. Draven untied the scroll. He read it standing in the open doorway, the cold wind whipping his hair. His scent changed instantly. It soured, turning sharp with rage and something darker anticipation. "What does it say?" Lenara asked, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Draven didn't answer immediately. He crumpled the parchment in his fist, the paper crackling like dry bones. He turned to look at her, his eyes hard. "Duke Orin of the South demands reparations," Draven said, his voice flat. "He claims we assaulted a noble guest. He claims we attempted to murder his betrothed." "Betrothed?" Lenara frowned. "Soraya?" "It seems she didn't waste time," Draven sneered, tossing the crumpled ball into the fire. It flared green as it burned. She ran straight into Orin's arms and spun him a tale of victimhood. "He is marching north." "Marching?" Lenara stood up, ignoring the throb in her arm. "With an army?" "With a war party," Draven corrected. 1,000 wolves. He thinks the north is weak. He thinks I am distracted by a new mate and a broken court." He walked over to the weapons rack, pulling down his heavy broadsword. The sound of steel singing against steel filled the room. "He is wrong," Draven growled. "Draven, 1,000 wolves." Lenara stepped closer. "Our garrison is half that. The winter patrols are scattered. Then we recall them," he said, checking the edge of the blade. "We light the beacons. We fortify the pass. That will take days," Lenara argued. "If they are already marching, they will be at the Frost Gate by tomorrow night." Draven stopped. He looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the calculation. She wasn't cowering. She was strategizing. "What do you suggest, my queen?" he asked, a flicker of respect in his gaze. "Parley," she said. Draven laughed a harsh barking sound. "Parley with Orin? He is a butcher. He doesn't want talk. He wants land. And he wants to humiliate me. He wants a show," Lenara corrected. "He is marching because Soraya wounded his pride by coming back here. He needs to look strong. If you meet him on the field, if you give him a chance to posture, we can buy time. Time for the patrols to return." Draven stared at her. "You want me to walk out and talk to the man who is coming to kill us?" "I want you to be the king," she said firmly. "Kings negotiate. Beasts just bite." Draven lowered the sword. He looked at her for a long moment, the gold in his eyes simmering. "You are dangerous," he murmured, stepping closer. He touched her cheek, his thumb grazing her jawline. "I thought I married a mouse. I married a tactician. I learned silence," Lenara whispered. "You learn a lot when no one thinks you are listening." "Very well." Draven nodded. "We ride to the Frost Gate, but Lenara, you stay behind the walls." "No," she said. "If I am the queen, I stand beside you. If I hide, they win." "It is too dangerous. I face 3 wolves in the snow alone, Draven," she said, her voice steel. "I can face a duke on a horse." Draven looked at her bandaged arm. He looked at the fire in her eyes, a fire he had ignited. He realized then that he couldn't stop her. She wasn't the fragile thing he had brought into this room a week ago. "Fine," he breathed. "But if an arrow flies, you run." The Frost Gate was a narrow canyon, the only safe passage through the mountain range that separated the north from the fertile lands of the south. It was a natural choke point. High cliffs of black granite rose on either side, dusted with snow. The wind howled through the gap like a dying god. Draven and Lenara sat on their tourney, horses at the northern end of the pass. Behind them stood 500 of the king's personal guard, grim men and women in heavy furs and iron armor. Ahead, the southern army was a sea of gold and red banners. They looked out of place in the snow. Their armor was polished brass, their cloaks bright velvet. They were flashy, loud, and arrogant. At the front rode Duke Oren. He was a thick-set man with a beard braided with gold wire. Beside him, wrapped in white furs that looked pristine against the mud, rode Soraya. When she saw Draven, she smiled. It was the smile of a cat that has cornered a bird. Draven didn't smile. He sat motionless on his black warhorse, a monolith of dark fury. Lenara was beside him on her white mare, her injured arm strapped to her chest, her good hand holding the reins. She wore no crown, just a hood of gray wolf fur. The two parties met in the center of the pass, 50 yards apart. "King Draven!" Oren's voice boomed, amplified by the canyon walls. "You look chilled. Perhaps you need a fire to warm you?" His men laughed. It was a crude threat, but effective. "State your business, Oren," Draven called back. His voice didn't boom. It cut through the wind, sharp and clear. "You are trespassing." "I am retrieving my property," Oren gestured to Soraya. "My lady tells me she was insulted, threatened, exiled from her home. She attempted to murder my queen," Draven said. "Lies," Soraya cried out, her voice shrill. "He is lying, Oren. He is trying to cover his own shame. He banished me because I wouldn't be his mistress." Oren's face darkened. He looked at Lenara. "So this is the replacement? The silent one?" He rode a few paces closer, his horse dancing on the ice. "She doesn't look like much," Oren sneered. "A pale little thing. Does she even speak? Or is she just for breeding?" Draven's growl was audible across the distance. His hand moved to his sword. Lenara reached out and touched his arm. "Wait," she signaled. She nudged. Her horse forward. Just 2 steps, enough to separate herself from Draven's shadow. "I speak," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but the wind carried it. It was calm, cold, "and I say that you are a fool, Duke Oren." Oren blinked. The laughter in his ranks died down. "A fool?" Oren sputtered. "I have 1,000 spears at my back, girl, and you are standing in the frost gate." Lenara pointed up at the cliffs. "Look up." Oren looked up. So did Soraya. High above, on the ridges of the canyon, silhouettes appeared. Archers. Hundreds of them. They weren't the king's guard. They were the mountain clan's wild wolves who owed allegiance to no one but the old code. Draven looked at Lenara, stunned. He hadn't ordered this. "The North remembers," Lenara said, her voice ringing out. "The mountain clans remember my father. He traded with them when the crown ignored them. They do not serve the king, but they protect the Quillen blood." It was a bluff. Partially. Her father had traded with them, yes, but she hadn't summoned them. They must have seen the banners and come to investigate. But Lenara seized the moment, weaving it into a weapon. "If you attack," Lenara continued, locking eyes with Oren, "those arrows will rain down before your spears can even be lowered. You will die in this canyon, Oren. And for what? For a woman who has already betrayed one king?" Oren looked at the archers. He looked at the narrow, treacherous path behind him. He looked at Soraya, whose face had gone pale. Doubt flickered in his eyes. "She told me the North was divided," Oren muttered. "She lied," Lenara said simply. "The North is one pack." Soraya turned on Oren. "Attack! They are bluffing. Those are just savages." "Silence," Oren snapped at her. He looked back at Draven. He was a greedy man, but not a suicidal one. A battle in a box canyon against high ground was a massacre waiting to happen. "If I turn back," Oren grunted. "I look weak. If you turn back." Draven spoke up, his voice resonating with sudden understanding of Lenara's play. "You look merciful. You look like a man who spared a lesser force out of chivalry." He offered Oren an out, an excuse to leave with his dignity intact. Oren chewed his lip. He looked at Soraya, then at the archers, then at the darkening sky. "The winter is too harsh for a campaign," Oren announced loudly, addressing his own men. "We will not waste southern blood on frozen rocks." He wheeled his horse around. "Oren!" Soraya screamed, grabbing his arm. "You promised me the throne." Oren shook her off. "I promised you vengeance, woman. I didn't promise you my death." He signaled the retreat. The southern army, grumbling but obedient, began to turn in the narrow space. Soraya sat alone on her horse for a moment. She looked across the gap at Draven and Lenara, her face twisted into a mask of pure distilled hatred. "This isn't over," she shrieked. "The curse is not broken, Draven. You will never be happy. The ice will take you." Draven didn't respond. He just watched her. With a final scream of frustration, Soraya kicked her horse and galloped after Orin's retreating forces. Draven waited until they were out of sight. Then, he slumped slightly in the saddle, letting out a long breath. He turned to Lenara. "The mountain clans?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Lenara looked up at the cliffs. The silhouettes were gone. They had vanished into the snow as silently as they had appeared. "My father gave them grain during the Great Famine," she said softly. "They sent a raven to me this morning. They said they were watching." Draven stared at her. "You summoned an army I didn't even know existed." "I didn't summon them," she said modestly. "I just invited them to watch the show." Draven laughed. It was a genuine, full-throated sound of joy that echoed off the canyon walls. He reached over and grabbed her good hand, pulling her knuckles to his lips right there in front of his entire guard. "Remind me never to play chess against you." He grinned. Lenara smiled back. For the first time, she felt the crown on her head not as a weight, but as armor. The victory at the Frost Gate changed everything. When they returned to Thorngard, the atmosphere had shifted. The whispers stopped. The pity vanished. Lenara wasn't the silent queen anymore. She was the wolf who stared down the southern army. She was the diplomat who saved the garrison. The council bowed lower. The servants moved faster. Even Lord Vane, the old skeptic, offered her a nod of genuine respect when she entered the hall, but the victory had a cost. That night, the adrenaline faded, and the exhaustion set in. Lenara's arm throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. The cold of the canyon had seeped into her bones. She sat by the fire in the royal suite, shivering despite the heavy furs draped over her. Draven was pacing again, but not from anxiety. He was restless with energy. The bond was singing. The threat was gone. He felt powerful, invincible. "We should host a feast," he was saying, pouring wine. "A real one, to celebrate the alliance with the clans, to formally introduce you to the northern Jarls." He turned to hand her a goblet, and stopped. Lenara was trembling. Her teeth were chattering. Her skin had gone gray. "Lenara?" He dropped the goblet. Wine spilled like blood across the rug. He was beside her in a second, his hand on her forehead. "You're burning up," he whispered, panic bleeding into his voice. I'm cold," she stuttered. "So cold." The healers said the infection was gone. Draven growled, scooping her up into his arms. He carried her to the bed, burying her under layers of fur. "Martha," he roared at the door. "Get Martha!" The healer arrived minutes later, looking terrified. She unwrapped the bandages on Lenara's arm. The wound, which had been pink and healing that morning, had turned black. The veins of dark purple were spiderwebbing up her shoulder toward her neck. Martha gasped. "Poison." "Nightshade?" Draven asked, his voice tight. "No." Martha shook her head, her hands shaking. "This is old magic. Shadow rot. It was on the wolf's teeth. The timber wolves were not just wild, sire. They were cursed." Draven felt the world tilt. Soraya hadn't just used oil on the bow. She had used dark alchemy on the beasts. "Fix it," Draven commanded. "Cut it out." "It is in the blood now," Martha whispered, tears in her eyes. "It attacks the wolf spirit first, then the body." Lenara let out a cry of pain, arching her back. Her eyes rolled back in her head. "She is fading," Martha said. "Her wolf is too weak to fight it." Draven grabbed Lenara's shoulders. No, you do not fade. You hear me? You do not leave me." "I can't," Lenara gasped, clutching his tunic. "Draven," the silence. "It's coming back. Fight it," he roared, his own tears falling onto her face. "Use my strength, take it." He tried to push his power into her through the bond, just as he had in the woods. But this time, it hit a wall. The rot was blocking the connection. It was severing the tie. "I can't feel you," she whispered, terror filling her eyes. "Draven, I can't feel you." Draven looked at Martha. "What do we do? Tell me." "There is only one way," Martha said, her voice barely audible. "The blood ritual." Draven went still. The blood ritual was forbidden. It was the oldest, darkest magic of the shifters. It involved a total transfusion of essence. An alpha could give his life force to save a mate, but the cost was catastrophic. It would strip him of his power. It would burn out his wolf. He would live, but he would be human. He would be a king without a wolf, a cripple in the eyes of his people. If you do this, Martha warned, you will never shift again. You will lose the throne. The pack will not follow a human. Draven looked at Lenara. She was convulsing now, the black veins reaching her throat. She was dying. The only thing he had ever truly loved was dying because of his past mistakes. He looked at his hands, strong, clawed hands that had killed for her. Then he looked at her face. The throne is just a chair, he whispered. He pulled a dagger from his boot. Draven, no, Lenara rasped, understanding what he was doing. Don't. The kingdom needs the render. The kingdom can rot, he said, his voice breaking. I need you. He sliced his own palm. A deep, jagged cut. Then he took her hand and sliced hers, pressing the wounds together. By blood and bone, he chanted, the ancient words tasting like ash in his mouth. I give what I am. Take the fire. Take the wolf. Take it all. The room began to hum. A red light, thick and visceral, began to glow around their joined hands. Draven felt a pulling sensation, violent and agonizing. It felt like his marrow was being sucked out of his bones. His wolf, the massive black beast that had ruled the north, threw back its head and howled one last, mournful note before dissolving into light. The light flowed into Lenara. Her convulsions stopped. The black veins receded, chased away by the influx of raw, alpha power. Her skin flushed pink. Her breathing deepened. Draven gasped, his knees buckling. He fell forward, his head resting on her chest. He felt empty, hollow. The silence in his head was absolute. No growls, no instincts. Just the quiet, fragile beat of a human heart. Lenara opened her eyes. They weren't just brown anymore. They were flecked with gold, his gold. She sat up, feeling the surge of power, his power coursing through her veins. She looked down at him. He was unconscious, pale, stripped of his glory. Draven, she sobbed, pulling his heavy body into her arms. The king had fallen. The wolf was gone. But the queen was awake, and she was burning with the fire of two souls. The winter had finally broken. The snow that had choked the passes of the high north for 6 months was retreating, leaving behind patches of wet, black earth and the stubborn green shoots of iron pine saplings. The air no longer bit, it merely nipped, carrying the scent of thaw and running water. Thorngard had changed. The castle walls were still formidable, the stones still dark and imposing against the sky, but the gates were open. Traders from the mountain clans moved freely in the courtyard, their rough ponies laden with furs and silver, haggling with the castle merchants. The silence that had once defined the stronghold, a silence of fear and rigid protocol, had been replaced by the hum of life. Queen Lenara stood on the balcony of the royal suite. She looked different. The fragile, terrified girl who had stood in the chapel a year ago was gone. In her place stood a woman of undeniable presence. She wore a gown of deep crimson velvet, cut to allow for movement, with a belt of silver links resting on her hips. Her hair was braided back in the style of the warrior wives, revealing the scar on her cheek, a thin white line, where the bowstring had snapped. But the biggest change was in her eyes. They held a glint of gold that never fully faded, a remnant of the power that hummed just beneath her skin. She wasn't just the queen. She was the anchor. Thinking of the border? A voice asked from behind her. Lenara smiled, not turning. Thinking of the spring? Draven stepped out onto the balcony. He moved differently now. The predatory, fluid grace of the Wolf King was gone, replaced by the solid, heavy tread of a man. He wore a tunic of simple gray wool, no armor, no heavy furs. The scar on his neck was still there, stark white against his skin, but the tension that used to radiate from him, the constant, vibrating threat of violence, had vanished. He came to stand beside her, resting his hands on the stone railing. His hands were calloused from the axe, not the sword. He had spent the morning chopping wood for the fires, a task he claimed kept his mind sharp now that the instincts were gone. The council is gathering, Draven said, looking out over his kingdom. Lord Vane wants to discuss the grain tithes. Lord Vane always wants to discuss the tithes. Lenara sighed, leaning into him. He worries we gave too much to the clans. Let him worry. Draven shrugged. It keeps him busy. It had been a hard year. When Draven had performed the blood ritual, saving Lenara's life at the cost of his wolf, the fallout had been catastrophic. The council had tried to depose him. A human king was anathema to the old code. They had called for a challenge, demanding he step down. But they hadn't reckoned on Lenara. She remembered the day she walked into the council chamber, 3 days after the ritual, with Draven pale and weak at her side. She remembered Lord Vane drawing his sword to demand the crown. And she remembered what happened next. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply let the power Draven had poured into her, the essence of the render flare. She had shifted, right there in the hall, not into a normal wolf, but into a creature of terrifying size, her fur silver-tipped with black, her eyes burning with the Alpha's authority. She had stood over Draven, a guardian monster, and let out a roar that shattered the stained glass windows. "He is the king," her voice had thundered in their minds. "And I am his strength. Challenge him, and you challenge the wolf within me." The council had knelt. Not to him, perhaps, but to them, to the partnership. They accepted a human king because the queen held the teeth for both of them. "Are you happy?" Lenara asked softly, breaking the silence. Draven looked at her. His eyes were amber again, human and warm. "Happy?" He tested the word. "I don't know if that's the word. I feel quiet." He turned to face her, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. "For 30 years, Lenara, I had a storm in my head. I had voices. I had urges to kill, to claim, to run. I was powerful, yes. But I was a slave to the moon." He took her hand, the one he had scarred to save her, and pressed it to his chest. His heart beat steadily. Thump, thump, thump. No racing, no panic. "Now," he whispered, "I just have you." "Is it enough?" she asked, the old insecurity flickering for just a second. "To be ordinary?" Draven laughed. "There is nothing ordinary about being married to you, my love. You terrify the High Lords more than I ever did." He pulled her into his arms, wrapping her in his warmth. He didn't run hot like a furnace anymore, but he was warm enough. "I miss the wolf sometimes," he admitted, resting his chin on her head. "I miss the speed. I miss the senses. But then I look at you, breathing, alive, ruling this kingdom better than I ever could. And I know I made the only trade that mattered." A sound from the nursery interrupted them, a cry, sharp, demanding, and loud. They both froze. Then, they smiled. "Your son is awake," Draven said. "Our son," Lenara corrected. "And he sounds like he's hungry." They walked back inside, hand in hand, toward the cradle that sat by the fire. Inside lay the heir to the north. Baby Kaelin, named for the loyal captain, was 3 months old. He had a tuft of black hair and eyes that were currently scrunched shut in indignation. But as Lenara reached down to pick him up, the baby opened his eyes. One was brown, like his mother's. The other was gold, bright, glowing, wolf gold. Draven stared at the child, his breath hitching. "He has it," Draven whispered. "He has the fire." Lenara rocked the baby, who quieted instantly at her scent. "Of course he does. He is a Morik. He will be strong," Draven said, a shadow crossing his face. "He will have the storm." "Yes," Lenara said firmly, "but he won't be alone in it. We will teach him. You will teach him how to be a man before he becomes a beast." Draven reached out and let the baby grip his finger. The infant's grip was shockingly strong. "I was the second choice," Lenara murmured, looking down at her son. "And you were the cursed king. And look at us now." Draven kissed her temple. "Fate is a funny thing, Lenara. It breaks us to fit us together." A knock came at the door. "Enter," Draven called. It was Kaelin, the captain. He bowed low. "My king, my queen, a message from the south." Lenara stiffened. "Orin?" "No." Kaelin shook his head, a grim smile on his face. "From the Southern Council. Duke Orin is dead. A hunting accident, they say. Though rumors say he was pushed from his horse." "And Soraya?" Draven asked, his voice void of any emotion. "Disappeared," Kaelin said. "After Orin died, she was turned out by his heir, last seen boarding a merchant ship bound for the eastern deserts. She has nothing, sire. No title, no gold, no pack." Draven nodded slowly. "Let her go. She is a ghost now." He dismissed Kaelin. The room was quiet again. The fire crackled. The baby cooed, playing with the silver chain of Lenara's belt. Draven walked back to the window, looking out at the melting snow. He thought about Soraya, alone on a ship, chasing a power that would always outrun her. He thought about the wolf he had lost, the black beast that was now a part of his wife. He thought about the boy in the cradle, who would one day have to carry the weight of the crown. But mostly, he thought about the woman standing by the fire. The Omega who was told she was replaceable. The woman who had packed her bag on her wedding night, ready to walk into the snow to save her dignity. The woman who had summoned armies, faced wolves, and taken a curse into her own veins to save him. He walked back to her. "Lenara," he said. She looked up. "Yes? You saved me," he said. "Not just my life. You saved my soul." Lenara smiled, and in the firelight, she looked eternal. "I just filled the empty space, Draven," she whispered, echoing the words of her old shame but turning them into a promise. "I filled it so nothing else could ever get in." Draven kissed her. Then, it was a human kiss. Soft, slow, tender, devoid of the biting, frantic hunger of the bond, but filled with a deep, abiding love that would outlast any winter. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, flooding the valley with light. The ice on the river cracked with a sound like a cannon shot, signaling the end of the freeze. The render was gone. The silent queen was gone. In their place stood a family, unbroken, unbound, and finally, home.